There's a tradition in forestry of fighting fire because the tradition is one of protecting the forest. The fuels begin to accumulate, the composition of the forest began to change.
These wildfires are increasingly becoming an urban phenomenon. We're not up in the hills, we're in downtown Santa Rosa. If we use these events as a wake-up call and we say forests are something that require stewardship.
This fire blows out and it runs head-on into prescribed fire treatment and just lays down.
We need to begin by mechanically reducing those fuels.
Well, there's really different dynamics in different forest types.
We were cutting 50,000 acres of old-growth forest a year.
Yeah, there was an erosion of trust that drove environmentalists to act.
And if you don't win, a special place is lost.
As long as I could remember, there had been at least 3 mills going here. A lot of distrust, fear, hate.
Log it and use the wood or conserve the land and lock it up.
This effort was getting past that on both sides.
We really need more acres of fire. We just need the right kind of fire.
My neighbor knocked on my door and said, "Shirley, Santa Rosa is burning down. It looks like a war went on down there. It looks like a bomb." Hard to talk about still.
We need to understand and respect these environments.
How it was grown. Is it safe? Is it healthy? How often do you ask that question about the paper that you use or the wood that's in your house?
So the people who are willing to find the new way and build a new community behind this sort of broader vision, that's the fellowship. That's all of us.
Hello, I'm Joe Furia, Executive Director of World Forestry Center, and welcome to the first episode of Adapting to the Era of Megafires, a community and expert summit on catastrophic wildfire in Oregon and beyond. I want to start by thanking our community whose generous support makes this programming possible. World Forestry Center has produced this free public series on wildfire not only because it impacts forests, but also because it impacts all aspects of our environment, our economy, and our society. Using Oregon as an example, over the course of 5 episodes, we'll follow our co-hosts, Matt Donegan, Katrina Holland, and Charles Wilhoite, as they interview experts to explore 3 key themes. 1, the full impacts of wildfire. 2, the science-based strategies for how we can protect our people, our forests, and our firefighters. And finally, the essential actions that we must take to build a movement and implement solutions. In today's episode, our co-hosts are joined by renowned experts in wildfire ecology, carbon emissions, and the community impacts of wildfire to discuss the current state of wildfire in Oregon and how we got here. With no further ado, we present episode 1, Understanding the Era of Megafires and the Threat Ahead. Hello, and welcome to the filming of episode 1 of our Wildfire Summit. But before I turn it over to our co-hosts, I'd like to start with a brief introduction of Matt. Matt was appointed the chair of the Oregon Wildfire Council by Governor Kate Brown in 2019, which was the latest in a series of senior appointments by the past 3 Oregon governors, including serving as chair of the Oregon Public University System and as a founding member of the Oregon Global Warming Commission. For the past 3 decades, Matt has been a global leader in forest investment and conservation finance, successfully structuring and managing multi-billion-dollar projects to achieve economic and environmental outcomes. He currently serves on the Lewis and Clark College Sustainability Board and is senior advisor to the Yale University Carbon Containment Lab. And with that, Matt, I will turn over to you and the other co-hosts to take it from here.
Well, thank you, Joe. And I'd like to say thank you to both you and to the World Forestry Center for your leadership. This is a vital topic here in Oregon and across the West, and we hope to make an important contribution through this 5-part series. And without the leadership of Joe and the World Forestry Center, this wouldn't be possible. So very sincere thanks. I am very pleased to be joined by two co-hosts, Katrina Holland and Charles Wilhoite, both of whom served with me on the Wildfire Council. We were appointed together in 2019 by Governor Brown. And so I'd like to take a moment to introduce you to my two co-hosts. And I'll start with Katrina. Katrina Holland serves as Executive Director of JOIN, which is a homeless service agency dedicated to supporting community members as they secure permanent housing and attain stability. Katrina is very deeply engaged in other volunteer efforts which empower community members to make Oregon equitable for all. She serves as co-chair of the board of Here Together and is a member of the Home for Everyone Coordinating Board here in Multnomah County in Portland. Katrina's got a degree from Portland State in community development, housing and economic development, with an emphasis on race, policy, and communications. And I can tell you, whenever I mention Katrina's name around the community, they all agree with me that we're very fortunate to have her leadership on the Wildfire Council. So Katrina, thanks for joining. And I would say very similarly, I'm very fortunate to have Charles Wilhoite here, also a fellow member, as I said, of the Wildfire Council. I could be here for a long time rattling off Charles's accomplishments and contributions to the community. Charles is managing director with Willamette Management Associates, which is a wealth management firm here in Portland. Portland Monthly Magazine has called Charles the Zelig of Portland affairs. He is a veteran of numerous boards. He's chaired OHSU, the Portland Business Alliance, the Urban League of Portland, Meyer Memorial Trust, the Nature Conservancy. He continues as a board member on the Nature Conservancy, as well as Northwest Natural and Legacy Health. So Charles, Katrina, thanks again for joining me here for the Wildfire Summit.
Happy to be here.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, we opened with a clip from The West is Burning. And I'd like to start with this conversation by just getting your reactions to that.
When I was watching that clip, The West is Burning, the only thing that kept going through my head was, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? What about my kids? What about the folks that we serve at JOIN who are on the street and have nowhere to go and have no choice but to breathe in the smoke or be exposed to these embers and these fires?
It is gut-wrenching to watch The West is Burning and know that that's a possibility every year. It's just gut-wrenching when you think about it, and then you have to come to the conclusion that Katrina just raised. It requires investment, and that investment is both prevention and preservation. We're talking about preserving life. We're talking about preserving property. We're talking about preserving nature. And if anything, polling Oregonians, we value nature probably as high as anything. But we all know that what is most important is human life and the quality of life. And I won't go through all the statistics that you went through, Matt, but when you think about 1 million plus acres burning in one season, doubling the average from the prior 10 years, which was triple the average of the 10 years prior to that. And if anyone is listening and paying attention, that's something we can't ignore.
But I think we should step back for a moment and actually update our situation here in Oregon. We keep setting more and more records across the West with regard to wildfire. And as soon as you film, a nice series like that or an informative series like that, you have more records that have been broken. And sure enough, in 2020, just a few months ago, around the Labor Day time, we had another record-setting series here in Oregon and across the West. And actually 2020 Um, Before Labor Day was shaping up to be a fairly mild fire season. Things turned quickly, and on Labor Day itself, multiple fires ignited under very hot, very dry conditions. And very importantly, they were spread by historic wind conditions, conditions that lasted for several days, averaging 20 to 30 miles an hour, gusting at 50 to 60 miles an hour. We had dozens of fires spreading all across Oregon, across the Cascades, the coast, Eastern Oregon. To put these in context, we had 1.3 million acres burn, which is over double the annual average for the last 10 years. And of course, the last 10 years was a significant uptick for the prior 10 years. And those were a significant uptick to the prior 10 years. So in an era of escalating fire, 2020 was even so really stood out. When you think about the impact, we had entire towns, communities here in Oregon that were just wiped out. Towns in southern Oregon like Phoenix and Talent destroyed by the Alameda fire. In Central Oregon, Detroit, Gates, Mill City were just really, really devastated by the Beachy Creek fire, including the home of State Senator Fred Gerard. Very, very sad story about the impacts to his family home. 9 fatalities in 2020, in addition to 1 missing person. Over 4,000 homes burned. Over 500,000 Oregonians were under evacuation notice. That's 1 in 8. And over 40,000 actual evacuations. Breathing conditions were horrific across the state, particularly here in Western Oregon. In Portland, where I live, it must have been 10 to 12 days of highly impacted breathing conditions. Folks here in the Upper Willamette Valley experiencing what folks in rural Oregon experience year in and year out. The community impacts, obviously very profound, most pronounced with our most vulnerable communities, but obviously the firefighters who put themselves in harm's way, trying to keep the rest of us safe and our property intact. Severe environmental impacts on forests, water systems, endangered species habitat, and then just the economic impacts. At this point, estimates are these fires are going to cost over $1 billion. FEMA does reimburse a substantial amount of that, but even so, the price tag to Oregon over $300 million, and about 85 million of that is borne by local communities and counties. So very big impact, whether at the state, federal, local level. These, and very importantly, at $1 billion, those are the costs to infrastructure, public buildings, firefighting. This does not include private property damage, economic losses to other industries, the wine industry. And most of the studies show that the real damage is yet to come.
We truly have an obligation to be proactive about this. We have no choice. Because if we don't, we just can't afford it. None of us can afford it. And I think about the domino effect of spending so much money unexpectedly to the programs that we deal with on a regular basis, like emergency housing assistance and stabilization assistance and utility assistance and food stamps and support for families that are trying to get on their feet, economic investments, economic improvement investments, education investments. All of those things are compromised when we're not proactive in trying to prevent some of these events from occurring, because we have no choice but to respond and make sure that people have new roofs over their head. And we're rebuilding some of the roads that were damaged. We're rebuilding some of the monuments that might have been destroyed in the fires. And I'm just heartbroken. That's the only thing I can say, is I'm just heartbroken. And I truly hope that the series that we're about to go through with this summit, that our elected leaders take this seriously and make some hard decisions, some necessary investments in trying to mitigate some of these impacts and prevent some of these impacts. Because if we don't, we're going to have to pay for it anyway. And that's scary.
It's telling us that we need to take steps to prevent wildfire that gets out of control. And I'll share this story with you because, once again, the statistics and the circumstances that you described and Katrina added to speak for themselves. But I went fly fishing a couple of weeks ago on the North Umpqua River. And fortunately, that's something we're still able to do in this COVID environment. And I can tell you, I got out of my car and I walked along the North Umpqua Highway, just looking at homes that were burned to the ground. I looked at piles and piles of trees that had to be cut because if they weren't cut, they would rot or become beetle infested and present other problems. But I will tell you that the two most impactful things that came from that trip to me related to the fact that I talked to the owner of the local motel right off of the North Umpqua Highway about the fire. Somehow the fire went all the way around his hotel, burned down his home. And I looked at him and I said, "How do you recover from this?" He said, "Well, it's pretty hard." And I said, "Boy, insurance," hoping that he had a good story. He said, "Well, you can't insure trees. You just can't. They're gone." And he said, "Those trees were there for years and years and years, and now they're gone." And he said, "I can't do a thing about it." And I talked to the fly fishing guy that I was with, and he looked at me and he said, "When we come in here as guides, we think about this as our livelihood. We look at what has happened and we ask ourselves, could it be prevented or could it be addressed so that the impacts are not so significant?" So once again, it's about people, it's about property, it's about the planet, the three P's, with the planet being nature. But people often lose sight of the fact that losing a home is devastating enough. Take it a step further, loss of life, you can't recover from that.
I would agree with this kind of notion of just being heartbroken, and I would say that one of the one of the difficult things in my position living here in Portland is that you go out to the rural communities year after year and you hear this raw emotion coming from them around, do you guys get this? Do you understand what this is like to live down here in Southern Oregon? And you talk to the firefighters, you talk to the communities, and you see this heroism, and it's very, very inspiring. And then occasionally you'll get somebody that just kind of comes out just with raw emotion and outrage and says, "Do you guys realize what it's like to live under the smoke year in and year out? It's a smothering, like, fifth season, the fire season, that we've all come to live with." And you try to connect with that, but that you're going back to Portland, and they're going to be stuck back in here. And so as much as you try to appreciate what they're going through, you know that there's not real equity here. That they're in a very, very different situation, a very vulnerable situation. Charles, you mentioned going fly fishing. It just so happened I took my kids fishing on the McKenzie River on Labor Day. And we parked at Blue River, Oregon. And my three young kids and we were there with other families, people, rafting and tubing and fishing and so forth. We had to get off the river because these winds picked up. And we started driving home. Next thing you know, we were in a traffic jam because everybody was trying to get out and get back home. 12 hours later, that entire area was incinerated. It was burnt down to the ground. And this community that I had just entered and been part of briefly and then left back to Portland, it was now gone. And if you go back to that area, I mean, it's devastating. And unfortunately, they don't have the luxury of kind of just, moving back. I mean, this is their homes. These are the communities they have to rebuild. And I think you see the heroism of the firefighters, you see the vulnerability of these communities, and it really moves you to try to do something and want to do something. And then, you experience for maybe a week or so, firsthand, just how bad this smoke is to these communities. And again, it really moves you to want to do something. Well, I am pleased to welcome our first panel. Future panelists are going to talk about solutions. We're going to talk about strategies on how to deal with megafires. We're going to talk about implementation. This panel is going to set the foundation for that, to really talk about what are the causes. Before we can get into solutions, we had to understand what's really driving all this. They're generally recognized three major contributors to these megafires. One is climate change. Two is changes in unnatural characteristics in our vegetation, excess fuels. And then the third is population growth out here in the West, and particularly as we dive deeper into the fire-prone areas here in the West. So fortunately, we have three panelists that are experts on these three areas. We have Dr. Paul Hessburg, we have Dr. Werner Kurz, and we have Russ Hoeflich. And so I was just going to ask each of you if you'd just take a moment to please introduce yourselves. So, Paul?
Hey, Matt. I'm Paul Hessburg. I'm a senior research ecologist with the U.S. Department of Agriculture Forest Service, and I study big landscapes and wildfire interactions with forest and rangeland conditions.
Great, thanks. And Dr. Kurtz?
Hi, Matt. I'm Werner Kurz. I'm a senior research scientist with the Canadian Forest Service of Natural Resources Canada. Our team does the greenhouse gas inventories for Canada's forest, and we're also looking at the impacts of climate change and projections of future fire risks and the like.
Yeah, well, thanks for joining us. And Russ, thank you as well.
Hi, Matt. So my goal as executive director of Thousand Friends of Oregon is to help to give you the land use context of the threat to people and communities around the state of Oregon, and for that matter, around the West.
Well, thanks again, Russ. I think that one of the benefits that we have with this panel is that we do have a local understanding and a deep knowledge here what's happening in Oregon, and then obviously Dr. Hessburg, with a broader regional perspective, and then Dr. Kurtz extending up into Canada. So I think this is an excellent panel to really get at what are the causes and where are things going. So we're going to start with Dr. Hessburg. And so, Paul, if you wouldn't mind, maybe, set this up by describing from a vegetation standpoint, from an ecosystem standpoint, how did we get here and where are things going?
All righty. What I'd really like to do is to talk broadly about how forests, fire regime conditions are changing in the Western United States, in fact, throughout Western North America. My assignment really is to talk about how we got here and some things that we see in the near term and longer term in the 21st century, and some things that we can do about it. Before I begin, I want to be able to show some photography that compares the early 20th century with the early 21st century, because these visuals are really compelling. And I'm simply going to take you from the bottom of the mountain to the top of the mountain and talk about significant changes in the forest. And then I'll discuss some deeper impacts of some of those changes. In this picture, I'm showing you early 20th to 21st changes in low elevation dry forest. And here I want you to see how the ridges and the south-facing slopes were open. They were typically meadows or sparsely treed savannas. Further up the hill, you look in the mid-elevation moist forest. These would be mixed conifer forests with ponderosa pine or larch in the overstory, along with Doug fir, and then some shade-tolerant species perhaps in the understories. Here I want to show how varied forest age and density patterns within these large landscapes went from being very patchy and varied to uniform. Finally, moving to the top of the hill, we're looking at the upper elevation cold forest. And here I wanted to show you how what were formerly burned and recovering patchworks had become continuous forests, often in a relatively mature condition in these cold forests. Here we're thinking about lodgepole pines, Alpine fir, Engelmann spruce in pure or mixed compositions. And between 1850 and the present day, there are many factors working together to create these changes, but I'm going to highlight a small handful that are the largest contributors. First, there's timber harvest during the 20th century, which removed primarily the large and old fire-tolerant trees, basically the trees that have survived centuries of disturbance influences. Second, starting with the loss of indigenous burning, Native American tribes in the US and in Canada the First Nations had been conducting widespread burning for millennia prior to the colonization by Euro-Americans and Euro-Canadians. Add to that domestic livestock grazing, development of the built environment, and then comes fire suppression. And finally, we add over top this the fact that the climate is getting warmer, drier, now often windier, and these conditions continue to escalate. Here's a quick reminder of how climate influences the fire regime across. Here I'm just showing the inland Northwest. You can see on the right, high fire years are associated with water deficit conditions. You can see that in the darkest shades, lots of fire and lots of deficit in the lighter shades, much less so. Look at the panel on the left. You can see that clearly our low fire years are when the water balance is clearly in line with vegetation needs. We also now understand that in light of the climate, a cooler climate aided the period of fire suppression we observed in the western United States. You can see on the left, we had a fairly warm, dry climate. On the right, a warm, dry climate again persists. But in that middle region between 1935 and 1985, we had the aid of a pretty cool and wet climate. And that allowed us to keep area burned for half a century at a relatively low level. What did that do to the forests? Remember, I talked about dry, moist, and cold forests. I'm going to show some reflections of change there. Well, the dry forest had low severity fire. It was common in those low elevations. Fires were frequent every 5 to 25 years, and this, in fact, was a stabilizing influence. It reinforced the return of low severity fire. And then we noticed that more extreme climate weather would allow more extreme fires to happen. So you see the transition on the right there from the historical balance between low, moderate, and high severity fire, shifting to the modern influence where low severity fire is a low likelihood event. In the middle, we have these moderate severity fires further up the hill. We're in the moist mid-elevation environments. Moderate severity fires would take some, leave some fires, leaving patchiness like you see in the upper left, and landscapes that look like the black and white on the bottom there. And they're moderate severity because you have mixed surface and crown fire influences taking out patches of the canopy, but you don't have running crown fires. These fires also tended to reinforce the return of low and moderate severity fires, and more severe climates would drive more extreme events. And here's the effect of those low and moderate severity fires. You see low and moderate severity fires allowed the removal of those surface fuels, the fuel ladders, and that allowed this more open canopy condition to persist. And you take fires out of the system and you see that regeneration and release now produces an overcrowded condition. And we can see this overcrowding is contributing mortality because their trees are less free to grow, and you're seeing that trees are more vulnerable, like you see in the dead trees, to bark beetle attack. High severity fires occurred in these upper elevation wet and cold environments. They were infrequent, productive areas, a lot more snowpack, and so high severity fire was the norm. But when you had more moderate weather and ignitions, you would have the prospect for low and moderate severity fire. That prospect is not common anymore. We just mostly see high severity fires and a simplified landscape. A couple things I want to reinforce from this understanding of the interactions between forest conditions and the fire ecology. Where you had low and moderate severity fires, locally, these more frequent fires continually thinned out forest patches, reduced dead wood, fuel ladders, and so that increased the prospect that those kinds of fires would return. And then across big regional landscapes, fires created patchworks of grass and shrub and young, middle-aged, and older forest, and open and closed canopy conditions, often with hardwood patches. And these patterns spatially regulated future fire size and severity. Also want to show that we learned a lot about the contribution of non-forest, that is, things that are not forest, but are growing on forest-capable sites. They're part of the secret sauce of resilient forest landscapes. The conditions look like this. We see them, non-forest conditions, emerging on forest-capable sites after high-severity fire disturbance. They can occur as bare ground, wet and dry meadows, shrublands, shrub fields, savannas, new grass, shrub, and seedlings and saplings, or mixes of these. They can persist for years to decades to centuries if they're maintained by fire. Small patches persist for a relatively short time. Large patches tend to persist for a long time because they're far away from seed sources. Why are they vital non-forest to forest conditions? What we've learned is that in many provinces, non-forest was in fairly typical abundance to forest conditions. Sometimes they were 50-50, 60-40, 40-60. And there was this interplay between ignition frequency, fire weather, and forest area, especially with high canopy cover. A tug of war, if you will, between factors growing forests and factors like disturbances that might remove them. So provinces vary in how much potential energy they can store as forest. Non-forest, on the other hand, is a benign fire delivery system once fuels are available to burn. And this is in flux, obviously, with the climate and fire weather. And this gives us some clues to what we can expect with a warmer and drier climate. We can expect to see less forested areas supported, and where forest occurs, more area with a low canopy cover. Regardless, the natural carrying capacity of forests was historically seldom realized, and that will be a true statement under climate change. All right, I think that ends my comments.
Thanks, Paul. I think I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Kurz.
So thank you, Matt. I want to speak a little bit about wildfires and climate change and the two-way interactions between the two of them. Paul talked about the impacts of climate change and the increase in wildfires throughout Western North America. As Paul has shown us, in Western North America, a century of fire suppression has changed many forest characteristics, and droughts, pathogens, and insects have been killing many trees and adding to the fuel loads of these ecosystems. Climate change has resulted in longer and hotter fire seasons, stronger winds, and more lightning, and all the indications are that the fire emissions and the area burned annually will further increase. What we have already observed in recent years is completely consistent with the scientific predictions, and the area and fire severity are predicted to further increase. Of course, there will be high interannual variability. We will have years in which we have very little fires and other years in which we have catastrophic wildfires. But what the science predicts is that with climate change, we're going to see overall an increase in the wildfire emissions. And of course, these greater fires and more intense fires will have adverse impacts on human health, communities, future timber supply, and of course, they contribute to further climate change. The warming will feed the warming. To give you a sense of the magnitude of the feedback of these wildfires to future climate change, let me give you some examples from recent years. In British Columbia, Canada, the wildfires in 2017 and 2018 in each year burned about 3 million acres. We're estimating that the emissions were around 200 million tons of CO2 equivalent per year. That is roughly 3 times the emissions from all other sectors in British Columbia combined. We have a large forest and a small economy. In California, in 2020, 5 of the 10 largest wildfires on record happened in 2020. And the state set a new record for acres burned with over 4.2 million acres. The emissions estimated at the moment are about 91 million tons of CO2, and to put that in perspective, that's 1.5 times the emissions from power production in California. And here in Oregon, 2020 was also the worst fire season on record, with over 1 million acres burned, and preliminary estimates of wildfire emissions are above 30 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So these mechanisms are providing big feedback to climate change. There is a very large focus in recent years on nature-based solutions and the role that forests and lands can contribute to increasing sinks. Governments are starting to invest to enhance land carbon sinks. Examples are the planting of large numbers of additional trees through afforestation and reforestation programs, and conservation efforts that involve reduced or no harvest as potential mechanisms to enhance land sinks. These can indeed be effective strategies, but the risks from where the risks from natural disturbances are low and where they remain low. But what we have seen is that the risks from wildfires are high in Western North America and they are increasing. And so strategies that are simply focusing on storing even more carbon in forests that are risks from fires could quickly release carbon back into the atmosphere. And this really then raises a whole other question around, should we be focusing on forests as carbon stores or as carbon sinks? And by that I mean the difference between, how much money you have in a bank account and how much income you generate. Given the current H-class structure and fuel loads and area expansion and projected climate change impacts, many scientists are in agreement that in many parts of Western North America, there's only a finite capacity to store additional carbon in forests and to keep it there given the wildfire risks. But what well-managed forests can do is they can help us remove carbon from the atmosphere and in doing so, provide timber and biomass to society. To achieve net zero or even net negative emissions, we must maintain or enhance land sector carbon sinks, and that will require some level of active management of our forests, including ways in which we can deal with future wildfires. A research group involving Paul and myself and others funded by the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions is currently investigating ways in which we can develop mitigation and adaptation solutions that enhance the synergies between the activities that are aimed at reducing emissions from wildfires and those that strengthen the bioeconomy, with the intent of making our landscape and our societies more resilient to wildfire. One of the big questions is how we can transition from the current unsustainable conditions created due to a century of fire suppression to more resilient forests that also contribute large land-based carbon sinks in the future. Our project looks at three broad areas. How can we maintain and enhance carbon sinks? How can we reduce the emissions from future wildfires? And to what extent can the use of biomass and other timber and forests be used to support a bioeconomy? What I mean by that is that historically, prior to humans, carbon was removed from the atmosphere by forests and was released back into the atmosphere again through decomposition and wildfires. And that, of course, contributes greenhouse gas emissions and smoke with adverse impacts on climate and health. What we think is that in some forests where road access exists and some of that carbon is at risk from wildfires and could be transferred to the bioeconomy. So thinning, removal of fuels, and other activities that are of low value could be used to feed a bioeconomy. The question is, can we develop new bioproducts that can make use of this biomass? And how this wood and biomass will be used also then affects the biosphere. If we use the wood that we extract out of the forests to reduce wildfire risk to produce bioenergy, we really just very quickly release the carbon back into the atmosphere. In other words, the carbon retention time is very low. And if we use it to substitute fossil fuels, we have low or moderate substitution benefits. So we avoid emissions from one sector by using that biomass. And what we're striving for in our life cycle analyses and ways in which we can improve the use of wood to help climate change and reduce wildfires is to develop methodologies that make use of this biomass to enhance the carbon retention time and the substitution benefits. Example, and have other co-benefits environmentally. So bioplastics are an example, some of the manufactured woods or mass timber buildings. We now have the tallest building in North America, an 18-story building on the campus of University of British Columbia that is made almost entirely of wood. And plans are underway to build a 35-story wooden building in Vancouver. Carbon stored, removed from the forest and stored in these buildings can be retained for decades. So what's the way forward? We have had, as Paul described, decades of fire suppression and land management decisions that, combined with the consequences of rapidly changing climates such as beetle impacts and droughts, collectively they have created unsustainable fuel loads, larger forested area with high carbon density, and fire risks throughout the West. We need to find a realistic and sustainable future path that satisfies the many competing interests, whether that is carbon emissions, jobs, conservation and biodiversity objectives, or human health. And we need to do so in a financially viable way. And we acknowledge that this will be challenging and it will require a transgenerational commitment of our societies. The question that we're trying to address is whether combining forest and fire management and bioeconomy objectives in such a way that we reduce greenhouse gas emissions and increase sinks while also achieving multiple co-benefits. Addressing future wildfires in Western North America will be a key to our success in this endeavor. Back to you, Matt.
Very thought-provoking. Thank you, Werner. Looking forward to engaging with my fellow co-hosts and hearing more about that. Next, though, we'd like to hear from Russ Hoeflich to talk about really what's the human contribution here, particularly as we think about population growth in the Western U.S. And again, where's all that going?
So thank you, Matt. As a land use advocate and forest health specialist, let me help by setting the stage and help you understand the scope of the risk to people and communities. Because of climate change driven drier conditions, we are now, as everyone is mentioning, living in an era of megafires. In 2020, Oregon experienced 2,215 fires, and 6 of which were megafires of 100,000 acres each. For Oregon, this means longer, hotter, and drier fire seasons, and more lightning-caused and human-caused fire events. So let me get into the details. In 2017, Oregon had 290 lightning-caused fires, and by the year 2020, a short 4 years later, that number has more than doubled to 662 lightning-caused fires. Now, with Oregon's population at over 4.2 million individuals, it is now estimated that close to 2 million of them are living in the high-risk ignition zone that we're calling a wildland-urban interface. That area totals about 2.5 million acres. Now, as the temperatures rise, this means longer and drier fire seasons. This leaves those who live near wildlands with a tinder-ready recipe for fire with more and more human-caused ignitions. So let me look at the human side with you for a moment. In 2017, the human-caused fire ignitions across the state totaled 779. Now, just 4 years later, in 2020, the number of human-caused fires doubled and jumped to 1,553 fires. Combined in 2020, Oregon had a total of 2,215 fires, which burned a little over 1 million acres. Now, these facts and figures represent elevated risk to all of us and our communities. Now, looking at the latest fire risk maps and predictive drought models, what jumps out is the extreme vulnerability to population centers and the essential infrastructure of our communities. I'll now be specific about the assets that are at risk. All these systems are extremely vulnerable. Our power transmission and distribution systems were built in a different era and not designed for the situations we're in today. Many of these fires are now measuring in the thousands of degrees. Our telecommunication system and thousands of cell towers are not designed nor intended to be exposed to these extreme fire conditions, putting human life at grave risk when they fail. The same is true for our buried fiber optics network. Now, our water delivery and filtration systems, from the pump stations high in the mountains to the taps at your home, are proving to be vulnerable in these extreme conditions. Our power production infrastructure, from solar to wind as well as our road and rail networks, particularly those that run through our wildland-urban interface, are vulnerable as well. Our food systems and working lands, including our dry land crops, our rangelands, and our fruit growing regions, are all at risk and valued in the billions of dollars. Many of these regions presently rely upon the goodwill of highly dispersed volunteers and antiquated firefighting equipment. Many of our rural schools, their senior facilities, their hospitals, their fire and police support networks, and mobile home parks are all at risk. Today, there are 750,000 homes in Oregon that are in the high-risk wildland-urban interface with combined assessed values in the billions of dollars. And with more and more smoke-driven unhealthy air days, the health of all citizens, including our most vulnerable communities, is at risk, proving to be one of the most severe and costly social justice issues of our day. So to close out my comments, I'd like to focus on the rising costs and financial risks to Oregon. Now, every year, political leaders and news pundits define firefighting suppression costs, which are significant. What they fail to define is the much, much more significant, catastrophic, long-term cost to community and, for that matter, to families. In 2018, Headwaters Economics did an assessment of the full community cost of wildfire in Oregon. What they point out is that on the nightly news, that the full cost of fighting fires is way beyond the firefighting suppression costs. The numbers we hear on the nightly news are a mere 9% of the total true cost of each fire. But as those whose homes and businesses and communities were destroyed in 2020 know better than most, 91% of the true cost of fire is associated with the economic recovery from the losses of homes and businesses. Our insurance industry reminds us that this also must include the recovery costs from damaged forest, from our vast loss of community infrastructure, including the issues such as lost business tax revenues, degraded property values, lost tourism and recreation, let alone the trauma and disruption to the community's social fabric. At the present pace, if we do nothing to address the firestorm Oregon is facing, and if we do nothing to address climate change, and we don't act and learn to live resiliently in areas where fire is a natural occurrence, the cost facing Oregon could easily surpass $100 billion over the next 20 years. So let me be crystal clear. The cost of action is going to be high, but the cost of inaction is going to be far, far greater. Now, luckily, Oregon already has a tool to help guide the way. The state's bedrock land use planning system provides the framework to limit our exposure to wildfire risk. The firestorm of 2020 was a wake-up call. It demands a call to action and a financial commitment by each and every Oregonian. As our governor's wildfire council carefully calculated, this is a $200 million a year challenge, and we will need to get the zeros right when we design solutions. You will hear more on the steps forward and solutions in the episodes ahead. I thank you for letting me set the stage.
Russ, that was very well done. And thank you. And thank you to your fellow panelists. I'm going to go ahead and open it up at this point to my fellow co-hosts. I see Katrina is with us, and I think might have some opening questions. And so Katrina, Holland.
So one of the things that kind of went through my mind as I'm watching this is and for good reason, because you want to make sure that you're meeting the needs of your constituents. I know that some of our some of our elected officials may not feel as connected to this issue or feel the urgency of the issue because constituents may not fully grasp the cost until it's in their faces, like it was in Labor Day. So for the layperson who is just trying to go to work every day to make sure that they're feeding their kids, what is a message that we can convey to? What is a message that we should be conveying as constituents to say we care about this? This is something that you need to address. I can't breathe. When this happens, like how do we build up that momentum so that legislators don't just have impending doom in front of them, but also constituent demands?
The solutions that we're going to have to come up with will have to lift all communities. And I believe that if we make the investments and we get the zeros correct, we will create thousands of living wage jobs, and particularly in rural communities where the economic impacts, particularly around the COVID situation, have hit really, really hard. But these will be living wage jobs that will persist over the years. And I think if we tap into the public will, there is a willingness to pay for the cost of the work that we're talking about. A recent poll that came out said that 55% of Oregonians were willing to pay $50 per family to help delve into and solve these problems. That's a start. That could produce, if we look at the math correctly, about $100 million a year in restoration investments. But that is needed, and the urgency that Paul described in his presentation, I think really speaks to that, and Vern as well.
Hey, Paul, great to see you again. You came out and spoke with the Nature Conservancy several years ago in Hood River, and you were equally informative today as you were then. Your knowledge is pretty darn deep, so we appreciate it. Question for you. Everyone who is not informed, and I don't mean this in any disparaging way, but who is not a scientist, who's driving through a beautiful, thick forest, looks at that and says, oh boy, what a beautiful forest. Even your pictures, you see the thinned area versus the field area. When you're talking to people who are listening and in a position to make some change, where do you go first to make it clear that an overwooded forest is not a beautiful thing on the surface? It's a potential bomb or a potential fire hazard. Where do you go first when you have those conversations?
First, thanks for your compliment, Charles. It's good to see you again. I have to lead with talking about forests being different up and down the gradient of the mountain and varying geographically significantly. So there's no one size fits all answer. There's a lot of possibilities to be considered. But then I tried to move into sort of explaining, pinning the corners in the middle of the problem, if you will, show representative kinds of changes and what they mean, how they influence, and then speaking in specifics about the kinds of things and work that work in different places. And there's geographically specific knowledge that we can apply so that this isn't a big black box. And often when I'm in a particular geography, I will focus on what we see there and what they experience there, and then draw analogies to what those places looked like before and how that worked and how they look today and how we expect that will function with wildfires and climate change. And they make explicit connections to places they're familiar with. So talking about the ecology of their places really helps.
Thanks.
A few questions. So first one is, I really liked your chart that showed the kind of the different bioproducts and their different carbon benefits in terms of duration and storage and so forth. And I was very interested to see how high mass timber wound up on there. And I think, as well as just manufactured products as being, carbon sinks. And here in Portland, we have a very thriving green architecture community. And this is a real hub for green architecture. And I noted that a lot of the buildings that you were showing were up in your home area in Canada. And I'm wondering, what are you seeing in terms of climate interested architects and folks that maybe not have been traditionally in the forest sector, how they're kind of embracing this, in your area and our area and other areas around the world?
Yeah, thank you, Matt. First of all, the housing sector and urban centers are among the largest emitters in the world. It's a very large proportion of our emissions, and it's because it's very energy intensive to build, and it's very energy intensive to maintain and run buildings. And so the architectural and engineering community is increasingly aware of those contributions. And the initial thinking was, okay, well, let's reduce the energy use in buildings. And there are now designs about, passive houses that produce more energy than they consume. But as those emissions go down, the awareness also increased that the embodied emissions in buildings become an ever increasing proportion. And it requires about a ton, it releases about a ton of CO2 to produce a ton of cement. And a ton of cement doesn't get you very far when you try to build a big building. And so that sector is becoming increasingly aware, and the wood sector is becoming increasingly aware that not only do these mass timber buildings store carbon, but they also have a substitution benefit. And what that means is that by using wood instead of steel, concrete, plastics, etc., we're actually reducing the emissions. There are many studies that show that for every ton of carbon in wood that we add to a building, we avoid about 2 tons of emissions from other materials. So we get a dual benefit, the prolonged storage and the avoided emissions in other sectors.
I would say one of the other questions I have is, in thinking about some of our most vulnerable communities, Join works with folks who are experiencing literal street homelessness. How can we ensure their safety during some of these prescribed burns, particularly? Because I know that, just to give a quick example, during the Labor Day fires, we were operating a temporary camp that was for folks to get off the street and be social distanced because of COVID-19. When the fires hit, the smoke hit. And even though you're in a sanctioned camp and you may have, toilets available and some hygiene and other things, you're still open to the elements. So in a prescribed burn situation, how do we protect them from some of those effects?
I think the top can be broadened just a little bit. And I would start by saying that all populations are vulnerable to the human health effects of wildfires. Wildfires produce the most PM 2.5 emissions with those itty bitty particles that are at a cellular size and influence our lungs just like asbestos. And prescribed burning can save half to 90% of the smoke for the same acres burned. So for all populations, including those that are most vulnerable, I would argue that from the human health side and the safety side, choosing the least smoke alternative is a clever move for all populations and especially disadvantaged populations. And in terms of the amount of time that populations are immersed in smoke, prescribed burns usually have a day or two when smoke of a lower level is influencing local populations, while wildfires for weeks and sometimes months can affect nations around that particular hemisphere. And so I think local and more distant influences are large with the wildfire question. And so I think that the way I would discuss it with a number of populations is to basically say, we don't get to choose whether or not the inevitable wildfires are coming. We get to and choose how we want our fire and how we want our smoke, right? In measured pulses where we have more, we don't have any certainty during prescribed fires of moving the smoke up and out, but we have we have a better chance of being able to do that with prescribed burning, short intervals, smaller pulses, less damage to population centers.
Matt, there was one comment I'd like to say in regards to Katrina's point about vulnerable communities. And we certainly understand in the Western culture how to house those in need during extreme climate events, either extreme heat or extreme cold. And we have to adapt to the new reality of the smoke-filled skies and the risks that Paul had defined to human health. And we need to create air shelters as well in those extreme smoke events, and make sure that we educate the public around the locations, but that has to be the norm. We have to make that investment.
Sure, Russ, I'd love to ask you a question, and this is kind of like a reunion. I actually was recruited to TNC by you, so good to see you always and listen to you.
See you.
You gave us a lot of information regarding the human factor. And when you consider the population will continue to grow, we're going to continue to have more and more human caused fires. We're going to have more lightning strike fires. How do you deal with people who deny science? Because TNC is based on science and you've been there a long time. How do you deal with that, and how do you relay the message so that's embraced?
I think we need to give a little bit more credit to the evolution of the public will and the public opinion on this issue. 2020 was a wake up call, and I think that we just need to be able to give that context of the transitions over time for people to understand it. Again, as I shared the statistics on lightning strikes and human caused fires, the more we get the public exposed to that and understanding the realities and give time perspective to the threats and the cost to community, they will move along in their awareness and their appreciation and their willingness to act. But this is an educational process, and it certainly is helped along by the fact that we're all breathing the air from these fires and wondering about the cause and the consequence of that. And we're seeing it more and more often.
Paul, my own question for you. I like the statistic that comparing, wildfire acres versus treated acres, and it's kind of a ratio of 3 to 10. And you also talked about a transgenerational commitment, which I think is exactly right. As we kind of think where we are now, we've kind of inherited this history that we've all talked about, and then you might think about having this liability or this backlog of acres that we need to treat. What does a steady state ratio kind of look like to you, where you think about how many acres we would want to be treating versus how many acres should be burning and so forth? If we kind of think about it today, it's 3 to 10x. What kind of a natural, healthy, beneficial wildfire versus treatments do you kind of think about, or how do you think about it?
We think about it a lot, and the overarching answer is, with climate change, research is not yet clear on how much needs to be treated, because all of the measurables that we've simulated so far in the past are related to past climate up to the start of the 21st century. Mark Finney's lab at Rocky Mountain Research Station did some really excellent work in the last 15 years, where they said if we could strategically place treatments across the landscape, how much would we have to treat, considering the fire weather inputs from annual fire weather measured before, say, 2005 or 2007, I think, when the work was published. And what it basically said, if you can strategically place treatments, you need to treat somewhere between 20 and perhaps 30% of the landscape to get a broader distributed effect. If you can't strategically place treatments, he found, the treated area has to approximate 40 to 50% of the landscape, and they're essentially equivalent to random treatments at that level. So in strategic emplacement of treatments is very, very difficult, because an awful lot of the landscape is partitioned into reserves from timber reserves to habitat reserves. Everything seems to be in some sort of a paddock. And so opportunities for strategic placement are basically nil right now. And under a warming climate, we haven't completed those simulations to really understand how well the kinds of barriers to fire flow actually work in the mid and late 20th century. My guess is that that footprint will actually get larger as a consequence of more warmer days and longer fire seasons. But in many geographies, we simply don't know that answer right now.
It's going to take all hands and all lands to really accomplish this. What does it look like to do that in the face of so many terrible social ills that we're dealing with, right? Where we in the United States, we're dealing with a significant racial justice reckoning. We're dealing with poverty and wealth gaps that have far exceeded anybody's expectations. We're dealing with homelessness and an eviction crisis where we could see millions of people on the street in the country if we don't do something about it because of COVID-19 and the economic impacts. In the face of such serious social ills, how do we lift this up so that we all share that same sense of urgency?
The big challenge that we face is that, on the one hand, we need to raise awareness about the risks of future wildfires. But doom and gloom is not going to motivate legislators, policymakers, or the public to invest into wildfire abatement. What we need to do is we need to create a vision of what the landscape could look like and what benefits might accrue from the actions that bring about a more resilient landscape and a more resilient future. And if we cannot create a shared vision, I think we will be finding it very difficult to get the sort of transgenerational commitment and the investments required to make this a success. So let's work together on not only identifying solutions, but developing a strategy that the public and the interested parties can buy into, and develop a shared vision of how that future could look like.
Are there any kind of final things that you'd like to say before we wrap up here? Is there anything that we're not asking that we should be thinking about?
I see in the last years a growing awareness and a willingness to change among an ever increasing number of the public. One of the challenges that we face also is that certainly in Canada and British Columbia, much of the forest is publicly owned, 94%. And so political decisions need to be supported by the voters, but the voters live predominantly in urban centers. And so it is very difficult to allocate funds to improve forest and fire management. What has changed in 2017 and 18 was the voters in the urban centers were directly affected by the consequences of wildfires. They were breathing heavily polluted air for days, for weeks on end, and they began to realize that this is more than a rural issue. I also agree with Russell that in order to bring about the changes that need to be done, we need to create opportunities for rural populations. And that means we need to create jobs in the implementation of these fire mitigation strategies. And the last point I want to make is that historically, the expectation of society about what forests are to be doing for them has changed. Centuries ago, it was all about providing hunting opportunities for aristocrats in Europe that owned the forests. Then it became a very heavy timber focus. Biodiversity became a big issue in the 70s, 80s, 90s. And I would say now the next generation of issues will also ask how can forests contribute to climate change mitigation. And so that means, once again, society will be looking at forests in a way that differed from the way we looked at it 10 or 20 years ago. And hopefully, I'm hopeful that with that change in perspective, there comes a willingness to invest into actions that make these forested landscapes more resilient and to overcome some of the decisions that were made 100 years ago in well intended, but that we have since learned had outcomes that were counterintuitive and unexpected.
In the last 5 years, I've been working really closely with the Washington legislature. Both the House and the Senate signed. And in 5 years, we've made very significant progress on at least 5 bills that have brought significant funding and attention to the districts of representatives within the fire caucus, folks who are heavily impacted by fire. And I'm very impressed when you communicate the vision that Werner was talking about. And you literally talk about the possibilities that are realistic and scalable. We're seeing reasonable action occurring as a consequence of that. And so I'm rather excited about the possibilities and pursuing things optimistically rather than otherwise.
Well, we cannot thank you enough, particularly our out-of-staters and out-of-countryers. You guys really pitched in here, and it's been great. And learned a ton every time, particularly Paul. Every time I hear you, I learned something more. So thank you. And Werner, I'm glad to have met you through this as well, and look forward to staying in touch. Russ, my friend, we'll talk soon.
Thank you so much, all of you.
So that was a great panel. We heard from Paul Hessburg with regard to fuel management, fuel loads, and how that's contributed. We to this era of megafires. We heard from Dr. Werner Kurz about climate change, and from Russ Hoeflich with regard to population growth, and particularly in the WUI. So Charles, I'm kind of interested in, what's your general reaction as you kind of put all that together?
Well, based on the comments we heard, and of course, these are experts in their field, they are experts in forest management. It's pretty clear that 100 years of suppression has resulted in the development of too much fuel in our forests. And with the fact that more and more people are crossing that wildlife-urban interface, more fires are being caused by lightning strikes due to climate change to some extent, and more people are causing more fires. We definitely have a significant problem that needs addressing. And the growth in the number of fires and the severity of fires and the acres lost every year over the last 30 years makes it clear we need a clear plan to address this issue. And we will not come out of this okay if we don't implement a strategic plan.
Yeah, I had the same reaction. If you look at the fuel buildup, you look at climate change, you look at population growth, these are all 3 factors that are contributing to the megafires, and they're all trending in the wrong direction. And so action is needed. I was also really struck by the impacts to our most vulnerable communities, our communities of color, our low-income communities. You think about the smoke effects and so forth. It's very startling, very troubling. I guess another takeaway is just how our systems really were built for another era, the data really bear that out. And you saw Paul Hessburg, that data that showed that we actually had a fairly cool temperature period through the 20th century. That probably contributed to a lower than typical, wildfire level of activity, and the data bear that out too. And so, if you actually look at the fire incidents over the past several decades, there was a very low period. There had been a very high period, and then it went into a low period, and that's actually when most of Oregon and the West was kind of built. And so we built during this period of low wildfire activity, and now we're entering this period of high wildfire activity and climate change and the excess fuels. And so our systems really were built for another era. And so we have some retrofitting to do on communities. We have some redesign work to do. We have a fuel buildup that we need to backlog that we need to work through. And so we've got a lot of catching up to do as we enter this next era. What was your take in terms of just the action, our ability to actually do something here, Charles? I mean, you looked at fuel treatments. We heard about community design. Are we are we at a loss here, or do you feel like action's possible?
Well, I was uplifted by the general tone and the theme from our experts. I love Dr. Kurtz's comment, we can't scare people to action. we have to provide a strategic plan that makes it clear what we're trying to do is protect an asset, protect people, and develop a plan that will take care of safety and all of those things that matter. And every one of our experts emphasize the fact that those who are economically challenged or disadvantaged stand to suffer the most. So this plan is something that's going to benefit everyone, but we have to go into our strategic thinking and our planning from the perspective of producing a product that works for everyone, not scaring certain people into action. And I thought that was a very interesting comment coming from a scientist. Well, you have to put on the table the magnitude of the issue that we're trying to address. And I think he did a wonderful job of doing that. As I think about addressing wildfire, what we're really talking about is addressing the severity of wildfire, the impact of wildfire. And when I think about it, we take steps to address the earthquake that we think is coming. We've passed regulation to make sure buildings are changed or designed to codes that will protect property and people. And when we look at our forests and we look at the rivers that run through them and we look at the landscapes that we all enjoy in different ways, why would we not look at our forests and make a strategic plan and implement steps to protect that forest in the same way that we try to address the natural disaster of an earthquake? So Russ did a great job of quantifying the issue, and now we have to convince people that it is investment that will return long-term gains, both financially and personally. So I think that's where we end up.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, there was another aspect that was built on, touched upon by Russ and by Paul Hessburg, which is this is a potential job creation opportunity as well. So the social justice topic kind of cuts both ways. And there's all sorts of social justice when you talk about who are the victims of wildfire or most impacted by wildfire. There's also social justice in terms of creating working, working wage jobs and family wage jobs for rural communities, creating this restoration economy that all three of them talked about, and putting people back to work in these rural communities. So there's a real opportunity here as well, I think. And I think, my overall impression, and this is also the benefit, Charles, that you and I have, and I think with Katrina as well, is that we do work in, lots of different areas across the community. We understand the importance of public money, finances, having, investment capital, and the downside risks of wildfire siphoning away this really critical revenue sources if we don't make the investments now. So we can either make the investments now, or we can make more expensive payments later.
Yeah, I would agree 100%. And statistics show that we spent about $1.4 billion fighting wildfires in 2017. Statistics also show that for every $1 million we put into forest restoration, we're generating 13 jobs, and those would be permanent jobs. So those are the types of statistics that we need to consider. But at the end of the day, the investment has to provide a return, and that's really what we're focusing on. It shouldn't be viewed as punitive, other than if we don't plan for it, exactly what you described will happen. Resources will be redirected to be responsive with regard to extreme wildfire rather than being proactive in controlling the impacts of extreme wildfire. Because the fires are going to happen. We just need to make sure that they're limited in their severity, and that's what we're trying to do. And we're restoring our forests to make them healthier and more resilient.
Well, thanks, Charles. I think with that, we'll wrap things up with regard to our panel one discussion. And as we look ahead to the remainder of our series, the key messages here that we see as the Wildfire Council is that, number one, the magnitude of the challenge here is very significant, and it's probably more significant than we typically realize. You think about just the impacts across all of Oregon. Every Oregonian is affected, and it's got a particular impact for our most vulnerable communities. So that's the first takeaway, is just to try to get our arms around the magnitude of this challenge. Second message is that there is a strategy. We have a strategy. It's been built on decades and decades of science and best practices. We here in Oregon have put that together into a holistic strategy, 37 different recommendations, looking at everything from health to community design, zoning, building codes, and ecosystem restoration. And then the third message is, with that strategy, we now have to step up and implement. We have to put the resources in place, and we have to make the investments needed and really meet the scale of this challenge. And so that really speaks to the format of the series. Episode 1 really addressed that first topic, which is the magnitude of the challenge. What are the causes of these megafires? Episodes 2, 3, and 4 are going to get to the strategy to take that on. Episode 2 is fire adapted communities. Episode 3 is creating resilient landscapes. Episode 4 is creating a safe and effective response to wildfire. And then episode 5 is going to be all about the implementation and how do we step up and meet the scale of this challenge. So episode 2, our next episode, is going to address how do we create fire-adapted communities. So we look forward to seeing you next time as we address that important topic. So thank you.
That concludes our first episode. Next week, our co-hosts will talk with elected officials from across the state about how we can adapt our communities to the era of megafires. If you enjoyed our program today, please invite your friends, family, and colleagues to join us and learn more about wildfires. The future of our forests and our communities depends on it.
I was calling my mom and saying, I think it's all gone, I think it's all gone, but I don't know. I didn't sleep for probably 3 or 4 days, and we didn't find out for about 4 days that our house was actually gone. The Mackenzie River is home for me. It's been home for my partner for his entire life. I can't reimagine my life anywhere but here.
I want to get to my kid. Oh my God, look at that.
Being a homeless teacher teaching homeless students is really an impossible situation to be in.
It's hard because, my mom lost her stuff for work. My dad lost all his equipment for work. So right now, it's been a big blessing to have people give us clothes, give us blankets, give us towels, things that we need to keep going. Even if it's the smallest thing, the smallest help right now is the biggest help to us.